90 feet down, 80 men lie flat in the dark, burning as little air as they dare. Above them, an American destroyer circles, listening. Then the first depth charge hits. To understand how these men ended up here, you have to understand what their submarine was built to do, and how completely the war refused to let them do it. The Imperial Japanese Navy built its submarines for one idea: the decisive fleet battle. Japanese naval doctrine held that the war in the Pacific would be settled by a great clash of battleships, a daylight gun duel between capital ships, and the submarine's job was to hunt down American warships crossing the ocean and thin their numbers before that clash arrived. The submarine was not a commerce raider in the German sense. It was a fleet weapon. Every design decision flowed from that idea. So the boats were enormous. The standard I-class fleet submarine displaced well over 2,000 tons, carried a deck gun, packed 17 to 19 of the deadly oxygen-propelled torpedoes, and could travel 16,000 nautical miles without refueling, across the Pacific and back. They were, by the standards of the era, among the most sophisticated submarines ever put to sea. And by the end of 1942, the war they were built for no longer existed. The carrier battles of that year had already proven it. The decisive engagements of the Pacific were being fought by aircraft launched from ships that never came within sight of each other. The daylight battleship duel the entire doctrine was built around was never going to happen. The Japanese submarine force found itself trained and equipped for a war that had evaporated, and no one had written a new plan to replace the old one. Midway had already shown what the new arithmetic looked like. A cordon of 17 submarines was ordered into position to intercept the American fleet and radio warning of its approach. They reached their stations 2 days late. The operation order had gone out on a timeline the boat's own transit speed could not physically meet. The American carriers had already passed through the empty water where the line was supposed to be. The cordon saw nothing. 4 Japanese carriers went to the bottom, while the submarine force, perfectly crewed and perfectly useless, waited for an enemy that was never going to arrive on the schedule someone in an office had drawn. What the Navy did instead was hand these ocean-going fleet submarines the one job they were worst suited for. They called them supply runs. As the war turned and Japan's surface ships could no longer reach the island garrisons scattered across the Pacific, the submarines were loaded with rice, ammunition, medicine, fuel drums, and sent to Guadalcanal, to New Georgia, to Bougainville, to every island where soldiers were slowly starving. Think about what this asked of the boat. A submarine designed to run deep in the open ocean was now ordered into shallow coastal water, the single most dangerous place a large submarine can be. It had to surface at night, at a predictable beach, on a schedule the supply situation dictated, a schedule American codebreakers were increasingly able to read in advance. The crew, already exhausted from weeks at sea, had to muscle drums and crates out through the hatches in the dark, racing to finish and dive before daylight brought the aircraft. Of the 128 Japanese submarines lost in the war, a heavy share went down on or near these runs. The men who died on them were not sinking American warships. They were delivering rice. Some were delivering mail. One boat, I-1, was intercepted off Guadalcanal by 2 small New Zealand corvettes that had been positioned using intercepted intelligence. One of them rammed her 3 times, using the ship's own hull as a weapon, and she was beached to keep from sinking. She had been carrying provisions and letters to a garrison that Japan's own high command had already privately written off as lost. The men who crewed these boats were not incompetent. Their officers were drawn from the top of the Naval Academy. Their seamanship was superb. They died anyway, doing a job their weapon was never meant for, because the institution that sent them had failed to think and never told them. Now come back inside the hull, because the mission was only half the horror. The other half was simply being in the boat. Start with the heat. The surface water in the central and western Pacific ran between 82 and 88 degrees year-round. Add the body heat of 90 men and the waste heat of diesel engines and electrical machinery, and the interior temperature during long, shallow submersion climbed into ranges the medical officers recorded between 95 and 110 degrees. Men worked and slept, soaked in their own sweat. When the boat dove below the thermocline into colder water, the hull temperature dropped and moisture condensed on every steel surface, dripping onto the equipment, onto the food, onto the faces of sleeping men. Then the air. On long submerged runs, carbon dioxide built up faster than the scrubbers could clear it. The chemical absorption system worked within its design limits, but the war constantly pushed past those limits. After 18 hours down, the CO2 climbed to levels the medical officers documented as producing headaches, clouded thinking, and labored breathing. After 24, it got worse, and that was when men were ordered to lie still and burn less oxygen. The stillness inside a hunted submarine was not the stillness of rest. It was 90 men managing their own metabolism as a survival strategy. Then the water, the drinking kind. Running the evaporators that made fresh water took power, and power made noise, and noise near an American destroyer could kill everyone aboard. So fresh water was rationed to almost nothing. Men on 60-day patrols bathed when the boat surfaced at night and the tactical situation allowed, which grew rarer as the war went on. Between those chances, they wiped down with rags and accepted the state of their own skin as simply another feature of the environment. And so there was the smell. American sailors who boarded surrendered Japanese submarines at the war's end described it with a kind of awe, an intensity of accumulated human and mechanical odor that had no equal anywhere in their own service, which was itself no garden. The Japanese crews had long since stopped noticing it. That was the thing about all of it. The adaptation was total. You do not survive 60 days in a sealed metal tube in tropical water by fighting the conditions. You survive by becoming a person who no longer registers them. And underneath all of it was the sound. A depth charge does not detonate against your ears. It detonates against your whole body, driven through water and steel into the bones of every man pressed to the deck. The hull flexes. Bulbs shatter. Cork insulation rains from the overhead. The boat's own steel funneled the blast to the men inside with an efficiency no other platform in the war could match, and it left its mark. Post-war health studies found hearing damage across the survivors, concentrated at the exact frequencies a close detonation drove through a submerged hull. Some of them never got the sound back out of their heads at all. When the boats were allowed to do the one thing they were built for, they could be lethal. 2 days after Midway, the submarine I-168 slipped inside the American screen and put torpedoes into the crippled carrier USS Yorktown, finishing her off and sinking the destroyer tied alongside. The single most important submarine success of the war's first year, achieved by nerve and seamanship alone. It was a glimpse of what the force might have been. It was also, increasingly, the exception rather than the rule. The numbers tell the rest. Of roughly 200 submarines Japan operated in the Pacific War, 128 were sunk, a destruction rate of 64%. About 10,000 men served in the force. An estimated 3,500 of them never came home. And for all of that, Japanese submarines sank 184 Allied merchant ships across the entire war. German U-boats sank roughly 2,900. The difference was not courage, and it was not skill. It was doctrine. A strategy so misaligned with the war that actually arrived that the men who died executing it were, in the truest sense, sent to accomplish nothing. And here is the part that the survivors carried longest. The German submarine service, for all its own catastrophic losses, had a culture that at least acknowledged the cost. Admirals who met the boats at the dock, who knew the men's names. The Imperial Navy's framework offered no such thing. You returned from a patrol, you reported the results, and you received orders for the next one. There was no institutional language for what had been asked of you. So the men absorbed it in silence. Not a chosen silence, but the silence of men whose entire structure had never given them any other option. Decades later, one of them could not sleep near a window when it rained hard at night, because the sound of water striking glass in the dark was, to him, another sound entirely, one that arrived through the body before the mind could stop it. He spent years filling a notebook trying to describe it precisely enough that it might finally exist somewhere outside himself. He never showed it to anyone, and he never threw it away. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. Thanks for watching, and I see you in the next story.